Have your pet spayed or neutered? Bumper sticker ASPCA. 17. Charlene. He's there. Who's there? That asshole. Are you sure you want to go through with this? We have to. Yeah, I guess we must do what we must do. Can you stay focused and not freak out? If you freak out, he could kill us or we'll attract attention. I'll try. Go get the bag. We have to work fast. He may leave or rape somebody else. They grabbed the bag and hurried out and down to the park. At the edge of the park, they stopped and opened the bag. They got out what they needed out of it and stashed it under a bush for future reference. Then they split up. Charlene watched as Marjorie scrambled silently up the railway embankment. Then she walked to the end of the walk at the edge of the park. Her palms felt clammy as she started walking toward the underpass. Her heart pounded and she felt lightheaded. She willed herself not to faint. She walked toward the underpass. The dark maw of the walkway under the tracks filled her with dread. This was the first time since that day that she had seen it. Every fiber of her being wanted to run the other way, but still she walked, her heels clicking seductively on the concrete. Sweat was running down her back as she neared the tunnel. As her eyes adjusted to the tunnel, she could see him lurking at the other end. She kept on walking, clutching her purse close to her body. She was shaking now, but she hoped he wouldn't notice. She could smell him. He recognized her. Oh, come back for more, did you? Leave me alone, you bastard. I can't do that. I like redheads. You were good. Don't you touch me. I do what I want to. You can't stop me. Leave me alone. She was crying now. She started to run. Her shoes clocked hollowly in the tunnel. He ran after her. She kicked off her shoes. He picked one up and threw it at her. It rattled off the walk beside her. When the walk turned to gravel, she went into the grass. She realized then that she should have done that the first time, as she could run much more easily. She ran up the path towards the pond. She noticed another strange feeling. She wasn't afraid anymore. She heard his breath behind her. Her mind came to total clarity. He was breathing very hard. He sounded tired from the run. Charlene started turning back toward the tracks. The man followed her. Charlene paced herself to keep herself just out of reach. She could hear him wheezing now. What's the matter, macho man? Are you running out of wind? Bitch, you were such a big man last time, picking on a woman carrying groceries. You must have been so proud. I'll kill you this time, bitch. Yeah, right, after you catch me. I should have killed you last time. You did, I'm a ghost. I've come for revenge. As they neared the laurel bush, Charlene threw herself at his feet. They both rolled under the bush. Charlene felt him grab her and pull her toward him. She elbowed him in the mouth. He jumped on top of her. Suddenly, he went totally limp on top of her. Charlene struggled out from under him. Thanks, Marjorie. Let's hope that I didn't kill him when I hit him. I never hit anyone with a sash weight before. No, he's still alive. Let's hope he doesn't wake up before we get him home. Wow, what a lump. Come on, let's get him home before someone notices us. Boy, he's heavy. You didn't have him land on you. You okay? Yeah, nothing wrong with me that a hot bath won't fix. We'll have to wait for that for a while. They picked him up between them and walked toward the tunnel. Marjorie supported him against the tunnel wall while Charlene retrieved the bag and her shoes. She put her shoes into the bag and slung the bag over her shoulder. Together they set off across the park toward home with the rapist between them. He was starting to moan when Marjorie and Charlene carried him into the apartment and dropped him on the living room floor. Marjorie took a vial and a syringe out of her jacket pocket, filled it, and jabbed it into the man's leg. He stopped moaning and relaxed. They put a layer of newspapers on the table. Over that, they put a sheet. Then they laid him on the table with his legs dangling over the edge. Charlene cut off his pants. She then shaved him and washed his genitals and thighs with rubbing alcohol. In the meantime, Marjorie was boiling a utility knife, a knitting needle, some sewing needles, and a pair of buttonhole scissors in a pot in the kitchen. After the water boiled, Both women washed their hands thoroughly. They propped up Gray's Anatomy up at the proper page. Charlene took a red magic marker and drew a line starting at the crest of his pubic arch around the fold of his thigh, to the tip of his tailbone, and then back to the point of origin. She stepped back and smiled. She followed the red magic marker line with the utility knife. She was amazed how little blood came out. Marjorie plugged in a soldering gun. As Charlene cut through a blood vessel, Marjorie would cauterize it. After they had cut loose the triangle of flesh and cut through the fat layer underneath, they cut through the muscle of his pelvic floor, still following Charlene's triangle. When the triangle was separated from his bottom, they started on the structures underneath. They cut the urethra above the prostate. They separated the vas deferens from the prostate. Then they cut through the rectum about 4 inches above the anal sphincter. They took a knitting needle and poked a hole through the side of the rectum about 4 inches above the cut. They then sewed the end of the urethra into the hole as a crude stoma. They then sewed the edges of the rectum to the edges of their incision. They then took the severed pelvic floor, washed it out in salt water to rinse out the blood, wrung it out and embedded it in a block of lucite, making sure that the member stood more or less erect. That prick will never fuck again, laughed Charlene as she admired the setting lucite. Yeah, but now comes the hard part. We've got to keep him alive, but unconscious until he heals. For a week, they took turns watching him. Every 4 hours, they dosed him with heroin. They stuck a tube down his throat and kept a steady drip of chicken broth flowing into him. It ran out the other end, but some stayed and nourished him on the way through. Saturday night, they pronounced him fit to travel. They loaded him into a wheelchair and headed to the park. They dumped him unconscious and naked under the laurel bush where Charlene woke up 2 years before. They left him on his back with his arms and legs spread as if he had fallen from the sky. On his chest was the block of lucite with his genitals in it, and on his forehead was tattooed in large block letters, rapist. None of this ever appeared in the major media, except for a small piece in the Weekly World News. The headline read, "Rape Victim Avenges Attack. Rapist Found Castrated in Park." The article gave few details, except for a picture of the block of lucite with a perfectly preserved male pelvic floor, with its member pointed skyward. Say, Marjorie, what was in that last file you shot that asshole up with? Oh, that. It's just some stuff I buy from the college kids to make people forget who took their money. Its trade name is rehipronol. They call it roofies. They use it for taking advantage of each other. It makes people forget what happened to them before they went to sleep. That's Rich. He'll think a ghost did that to him. Your cheating heart will tell on you. Willie Nelson, copyright ASCAP 1956. 18. Chet couldn't sleep again. Sleep fled at bedtime. Sure, he'd try, but as he lay there, the image of the little blue car on the tracks came to visit. If he did doze off, it was worse. He would jerk awake in the cab of the locomotive, just in time to see the little car drive onto an uncontrolled grade crossing. He would do the right things. He would slam the throttle closed and yank the brake lever. He would hear the grinding of metal under him as the train slid to a stop. It always took too long. He would climb down from the cab and see blood mixed with oil, gasoline, and transmission fluid splashed on the front of the locomotive. As he walked around, he saw the twisted piece of blue metal wrapped around the front coupler. It wasn't very big. Over the years, he had hit many deer. They would go thump in the night. Sometimes they would leave a little bit of fur, but usually all he'd hear was a thump. The little blue car was different. He saw it coming and heard it go under the locomotive. Every night he heard the same noise. It gnawed at him. It got worse after the newspapers got the story. There was the usual set piece about uncontrolled grade crossings. There were the usual lurid pictures of various car versus train encounters, but what hurt were the pictures of the people inside the cars. It made them real. It talked about their families. Chet cried a lot the first week or so. He took a leave of absence from the railroad. He just couldn't climb into a locomotive again. Mostly, he wandered around town at all hours of the night. During one of his nocturnal wanderings, he spotted Jolene's boyfriend in his pickup, trolling the red light district. So, Jolene isn't enough for that bum, he muttered to himself. Billy Bob's truck pulled to the curb, and a small black woman with blonde hair, a miniskirt, and impossibly tall, high-heeled shoes climbed into the cab. They sat in the cab and talked, and then they drove away. Chet hated Billy, Bob even more now. He loved his daughter and wanted to protect her, even if she didn't understand and didn't want to be protected. He really didn't want his daughter getting some sociable disease from the people that Bob was running with. Those women climbed into a pickup for only one reason. That reason was common knowledge even for Jolene. If he had proof. He thought about the Polaroid in the hall closet. He wished he had it with him now. He hoped that Bob hadn't fenced it like many other household objects that turned up missing after Bob left. He turned for home, feeling strangely better. He found a use for his wanderings. Hell, he thought if I can't sleep, at least I can get rid of Bob. On his way home, he stopped at the all-night drugstore and bought some film. He hoped that he could get a good picture because he'd never tried to shoot the Polaroid at night. He didn't know anybody that had. He went straight to the hall closet and looked for the Polaroid. He was lucky. It was there. It had been there for 10 years. It seemed like such a neat toy when he bought it, but the film was so expensive and copies of prints were a hassle. He put it on the shelf and bought a cheap 35 millimeters. It was on the shelf beside the Polaroid because after he bought it, there never seemed to be anything worthy of photographic documentation. Why document arguments, as that was all that was happening around the house? Maybe this time, the pictures would serve to bring his family together. He loaded the camera and shot a picture of the dog, which yelped from the flash and hid under the table. The picture popped out and looked pretty good, even though he got more floor than dog. He put the Polaroid in his coat pocket and hung the coat on the back of a chair. He poured himself a bowl of frosted flakes and turned on Letterman. About halfway through the nightly list, he changed the channel to Leno. He wished he had cable because that was all he could get in that part of town. The high rise blocked out ABC and Fox. He ate his cereal and watched Leno's monologue. He really couldn't follow the thread of it. None of the things Leno was talking about had any relevance to a tired railroad man with a dysfunctional family and a heavy heart. His wife was asleep, and Jolene was hiding in techno in her room. Occasionally, the bass notes rattled dishes. Chet wondered why his life turned out that way. It was as if Merle Haggard and Johnny Cash had written his life as a country western song with a little help from Willie and Waylon. The blood on the tracks seemed like the least of it right now. His wife had been sullen and withdrawn ever since Jolene had hit puberty. Jolene was loud, abrasive, argumentative, and generally disrespectful. She always had a Walkman hooked to her ears when she wasn't talking on the phone or sneaking off with Bob. Any communication was in the form of a petulant complaint about the food, her allowance, or the state of the house. Any answer was greeted with a stream of profanity and a slammed door. Sometimes the stream of profanity was lubricated with a torrent of tears. Then the stereo would be tweaked to the painful setting, and she wouldn't come out until she got hungry. He found it very hard to believe that hellish creature was the same soft and pink baby that he doted on not too terribly long ago. He wished he'd been given more children, but he only got one, and Jolene was it. He named her after one of Dolly's songs because the name and the song haunted him. He still, after so many years, wasn't sure if it was Dolly's voice or the lyrics, but the song ran true through his brain at strange moments. Jolene had grown to be the character in the song. He didn't expect that at all. Dawn found him still in his chair, with the cereal bowl upside down on the floor. His back ached, his bladder hurt, his mouth was dry, and his legs were numb. He hated dozing off like that, but that was how sleep came, violently and painfully and without warning. Today was on the TV, and they were talking about yet another hopeful cure for AIDS. He staggered to his feet, stumbled to the doorway, and almost fainted as the blood rushed to his numb feet and legs. He stood and braced himself until the rushing sound in his ears subsided. He swore to himself not to spend the night in that chair again, but he knew that he had no control over where or when he slept, so he chalked it up as yet another empty promise to himself. He stumbled into the bathroom and relieved himself. It hurt to urinate, and he cramped afterwards. He was glad that he wasn't drinking beer last night. He looked in the mirror and realized that he really hadn't been paying much attention to his own needs. Shit, he said, it's like being on a long drunk without the fun of drinking. Indeed, he looked like a wino. Washing and shaving didn't help much. His complexion was pale streaked with little red lines from broken blood vessels. His cheeks were sunken from hit or miss meals, usually taken at night, and of questionable nutrition. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep and periodic crying jags. His hair was going gray and tufts of it were falling out. He tried to remember when the last time he had talked to his wife and drew a blank. He wondered what he'd say to her anyway in light of last night's discovery. He knew she'd fly off the handle and there would be a scene. Jolene would go outside and slam the door behind her. She usually stayed gone for days. He couldn't stand the thought of that. He had to do it right to save the family relationship, and it wouldn't do to let things out prematurely. He stepped into the shower, stood under the hot water, and scrubbed the grunge of too many night walks from his body. It felt good. The ache was finally going out of his back when the hot water heater ran out of hot. He went quietly upstairs and dressed. Jolene's door was locked when he tried it. He knew she was in there because the stereo was on, though it had run out of music hours earlier. He wondered what had triggered this current puffest. She had been in there when he got home. His wife had retired for the night, so he was clueless, which was probably a good thing. When he knew why she was pouting upstairs, he was usually angry about it. There were tear stains on his wife's pillow, and it didn't look like her night was much better than his was. Since the accident, she had become even more sullen, withdrawn, and slept a lot. He wished he could do something to make her feel better, but it was all he could do to get himself through each day. He closed the bedroom door and went back downstairs. When he opened the refrigerator, he realized that he would have to make groceries happen. He didn't really know how long it had been since he had worked or collected a paycheck. He had spent the last few dollars he had on film for the Polaroid. He had seen refrigerators and appliance stores with more food in them. He still couldn't face climbing into a locomotive, but he was out of sick time, out of vacation, and if he didn't do something soon, he wouldn't have a job to go back to. As he rummaged around the kitchen looking for overlooked ingredients, he tried to weigh his options. Since the arrival of automation, there weren't many railroad jobs. The trains traveled with two-man crews. The switches in the yard were electrically controlled from the tower. The track crews were simply heavy equipment operators, skilled at operating mind-numbingly complicated machines. The days of unskilled railroad labor were long gone. He was lucky to be a railroad engineer, and he knew it. He had 20 years in, but he was still too young to retire. In his search for food, he turned up the makings for some hoe cakes. That would feed his family today. You need to own your deeds, because you have to live with them anyway. Fred Katz, Making of a Misogynist. 19.